In part 1, we saw how, in 1932, a part of the evangelical church in Germany had formed a body called the German Christians, which had as part of its program the removing of Jews from the church's message through turning away from the Old Testament, reducing and reinterpreting the New Testament, and called for the purification of the German race through protection from incompetent and inferior peoples and the destruction of Marxism. This was in line with National Socialist thinking and clearly opposed to anything written in the Bible. More traditional Christians rejected this message and grouped around the confessing church and people like World War I submarine commander Martin Niemoeller. Ulrich Sporleder was a young pastor in this group who opposed National Socialism. He had been arrested and spent time in prison for his sermons, which included praying for the Jews and other victims of National Socialism. He lived in Marienberg, today Malbork, which you can see in this video. On the 26th of August 1939, on the very day that Molotov was being entertained by Stalin in Moscow, he was called up for military service. He took part in the invasion of Poland as an officer in a tank destroyer unit set up in Military District 1, which belonged to the Brandt Group, the Third Army. His call-up was promoted by influential friends in order to protect him from the threat of further imprisonment and placement in a concentration camp. Nevertheless, 2 political proceedings were still pending against him in Berlin. During his Christmas leave in January 1940, Sporleder took his second exam, which had been interrupted by his call-up, and was then ordained as a pastor in Königsberg. As before, he refused to take the Führer oath required by the church authorities. On the 10th of May 1940, Sporleder was deployed as a lieutenant in the heavy tank destroyer unit in the French campaign as part of Panzer Group von Kleist. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class and was seriously wounded in June 1940. After a stay in hospital in Augsburg, he wanted to travel to Marienberg in mid-July. There he had arranged to meet Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, after completing a tour through East Prussia, was changing his original route from Danzig to Berlin and, according to his own calendar entry, was planning to stay with Ulrich Sporleder in Marienberg and Marienwerder from the 25th to 26th of July 1940. At this time, Sporleder corresponded with contacts in Switzerland via official letters and coded articles, including from the Swiss radio news.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des 22. Juni trat die deutsche Wehrmacht in breiter Front zum Angriff an, um die heimtückische Bedrohung des Reiches und Europas durch die bolschewistischen Verräter abzuschlagen. Diese Bilder zeigen Ausschnitte aus dem feigen Überfall der sowjetischen Machthaber gegen das kleine, tapfere Finnenvolk im Spätherbst 1939.
On the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany turned on its former ally, the Soviet Union. Sporleder was deployed in command of a heavy tank destroyer company. In time, this unit would be equipped with such weaponry as the Elephant, Nashorn, and Panzer Selbstfahrwaffe IV, Dicker Max, as well as apparently the Panzer Selbstfahrwaffe V, Sture Emil, of which only 2 prototypes were made, one of which was captured at Stalingrad and can be seen today at the Tank Museum near Moscow. Sporleder repeatedly sent texts from the front to his Marienberg confessional congregation, which were read out by congregation members or family members, such as his sister-in-law Eva Szymanski, née Wieserborn. In addition, an opposition circle of listeners formed at his brother-in-law's rectory in Lauenburg, today Lemberg, which also included Army General Staff officers. Because of a sermon and speech he gave on the Eastern Front at Christmas 1941, Sporleder was threatened with renewed arrest in 1942 and charges before the Reich military court. Sporleder was probably able to avoid conviction by the Reich military court through the protection of high-ranking officers and influential lawyers. At the beginning of October 1942, he was seriously wounded again and sent home. This was lucky. Had he not been wounded, he would have been in Stalingrad. He was able to return to Marienberg to recover, where he immediately resumed his service in the community, and together with his wife, Werner Lembruck and Horst Szymanowski and other helpers, he helped organize an East Prussian parsonage chain, that is to say, a group of pastors and their families who took in Jews and other persecuted people in their churches or private homes and concealed their identities or hid the people in order to protect them from the Nazis. In the case of Sporleder, it was to rescue Berlin Jews threatened with deportation. The Berlin office of the Goslar Mission under Hans Lokis and Eberhard Bethke served as a contact point. The Sporleder family's Marienberg apartment at Müllengraben 5, today part of Ulica Mickiewicza, which you can see here, as well as various church buildings and Lembruck's house in Rehov, were among what Horst Szymanowski called secret dwellings. A Jewish person from Berlin was hidden in Sporleder's apartment for longer than planned due to a lack of alternative accommodation. He survived the Holocaust and lived later in Sweden and then in the United States of America. In March 1943, Sporleder had completed an officer's course at the Wehrmacht's headquarters in Danzig and then took part in Operation Citadel as company commander of the 521st, the 1st Heavy Tank Destroyer Division. This was the Battle of Kursk, which proved to be Hitler's last throw of the dice in the East. It came at the same time as the Allied landings in Sicily and proved to be a major defeat. During the defensive fighting that followed the Red Army's counteroffensive, Sporleder was seriously wounded again on the 14th of July 1943. After treatment in the field hospitals in Minsk and Warsaw, he spent the period from August to November 1943 recuperating in Marienberg and continued his resistance activities there, as well as in Lauenburg and Berlin. On the 1st of December 1943, Sporleder was promoted to captain and assigned to the Eastern Front near Smolensk to lead his heavy tank destroyer division. On the 13th of July 1944, Sporleder was appointed deputy commander of a combat group stationed east of Lublin under the 36-year-old Major Karl Max Freiherr von Hohenfels. This unit, called the Kampfgruppe Hohenfels, was established on that day and was under the command of the 56th Panzer Corps, the objective of which, for them, was to counter any Soviet breakthrough across the Bug River. The previous week, on the 6th of July 1944, in anticipation of a new Soviet offensive, the German army retreated to the western bank of the Bug River. However, this was not enough. Massively outnumbered, the Eastern Front was collapsing and the Red Army was about to cross the former Nazi-Soviet demarcation line in occupied Poland. At this time, Sporleder's wife was advised by people in the resistance to leave Marienberg and go to a safe place in the Harz Mountains with the children. This was presumably in the run-up to the attempted coup d'etat against the Nazi regime. Strangely enough, Heinrich Himmler also advised his wife to get out of Berlin on the 19th of July, 1944. An attempt to kill Hitler was planned for the 15th of July 1944. The plan was aborted, but not before the reserve army in Berlin had been mobilized. At around 1300 hours, the order to move was given to Sporleder's unit. A short time later, the order came to postpone the operation. On the 20th of July 1944, the day of the assassination attempt on Hitler, the detachment with its heavy tank destroyers, contrary to orders, set course for the town centre of Lublin. In command of the German forces in the Lublin region was 64-year-old SS Gruppenführer Hilmar Moser. In the town, the SS food depots and the senior field command were occupied by Sporleder's unit. The order subsequently went out from there to release the last prisoners from Majdanek concentration camp. What role Sporleder played in this is unknown, since the war diaries dated the 19th to the 25th of July 1944 were destroyed, probably in an effort to conceal what was going on during the attempted coup. Lublin, however, was threatened by the Red Army. Seizing Lublin made no sense for the resistance, as the Soviets were about to move in. And they moved in quicker than anyone expected, on the express instructions of Stalin. Obviously, Stalin would have wanted the coup against Hitler to fail. His objective was to capture as much territory as possible. After all, his life wasn't in danger. However, I doubt he knew about the plot against Hitler. His plans were different. The Soviet plan had not initially been to attack Lublin. However, politics entered into the fray. On the 20th of July 1944, the Polish Committee of National Liberation, the PKWN, was established in Moscow on his orders. This was the communist puppet regime that was to replace the legal Polish government which was in London. In order to appear serious, a large city needed to be captured from which the new regime could proclaim itself. Therefore, Stalin demanded that Zhukov and Rokossovsky capture the city of Lublin by the 27th of July 1944 at the latest. Stavka Directive number 220149 stressed, "This is absolutely necessary due to the political situation and the interests of an independent democratic Poland." Obviously that's a quote. Stalin's plans were neither for an independent nor a democratic Poland. Marshal Rokossovsky then ordered the deployment of the 2nd Tank Army, which had 756 tanks, including 448 T-34-85s and 130 M4 Shermans. On the 21st of July 1944, he personally supervised the tank units crossing the Bug. Lieutenant General Bogdanov had his troops advance across 3 bridges into the bridgehead and then race onto Lublin. On the 22nd of July 1944, they reached Helm. During that day, the Soviet tanks raced on, leaving the infantry behind. This was further to Stalin's instructions, but must have come at a great cost in lives and equipment. Of course, for Stalin, this didn't matter. What was more important was establishing his own government in Poland. By the evening of that day, they had reached the river Wieprzь, and on the morning of the 23rd of July, after 30 minutes of artillery preparations, they entered Lublin.
Marshal Rokossovsky, commander of the Soviet armies in Poland, watches his men advance to the crossing of the river Bug on the road to Lublin. Like their allies on the Western Front, the flyers of the Red Air Force have proved more than a match for the Luftwaffe. Under cover of a heavy barrage, the Russians forced the crossing of the Bug River. In the path of their advance lay the town of Hell. The German defenders were driven out, leaving the starved Polish civilians to welcome the victorious Russians. Following the Russians came Polish contingents. Six Poles condemned to die by the Nazis watched with joy the rout of the Germans. For them it meant life itself, though for many of their companions the rescuers had arrived too late.
In April 1944, the Supreme Command of the German Army had designated Lublin as a Festerplatz, a fortress, and it was to have 4 lines of fortifications. If you look at a physical map and the layout of the city and its surroundings as it was in 1944, Lublin does not lend itself to being a fortress. What is clear is that the military resistance did not control much of the city, as on the 22nd of July 1944 a massacre of prisoners took place in Lublin Castle, which had been used as a prison. This was the first massacre of prisoners in Poland following the retreat of the German army. Many more such massacres were to follow. On the 20th of July 1944, SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Kopper, the higher SS and police leader for the general government, issued an order concerning the evacuation of prisons and camps located close to the front line. This document clearly stated that, if the military situation so requires, steps must be taken at the appropriate time to completely liquidate the prisoners. In the event of a sudden development that makes it impossible to transport the prisoners must be liquidated, and the remains of those shot must be destroyed as far as possible, by burning, blowing up buildings, etc. Jews should be treated in a similar manner. In no case should prisoners in prisons or Jews be allowed to be released to the enemy. On the 22nd of July 1944 there were still about 1,400 prisoners in the cells of Lublin Castle. In the morning a special murder unit was sent from the Lublin Gestapo headquarters to the castle. This small unit was headed by SS Hauptsturmführer Hermann Molotov, who had a very bloody career during the war in liquidating the ghettos of Lublin, Warsaw and Radom. He was accompanied by SS officers Zauder, Kölnel, Zaleska and Michwald, and probably also Roth and Wiełupski. At that time, German guards were still in the prison, including prison warder Peter Dominik and his deputy Andreas Hoffmann. The murderers went from cell to cell killing those inside. The killing lasted around 2 hours. It was interrupted by an order to immediately evacuate the prison, which Warden Peter Dominik received around noon. The Germans then hurriedly left the castle, taking with them around 200 prisoners who were German. Only Polish and Soviet guards remained in the prison, and they were ordered to release the surviving prisoners at 1500 hours. Immediately after the Germans left, the Soviet guards fled, no doubt fearing what their compatriots could now do to them, and the Polish guards, without waiting until 1500 hours, began opening the cells. About 1,000 prisoners were still alive. Around 300 people had been murdered. A list prepared by Róża Bieluszko-Siechowa contains 288 surnames of identified victims of the crime. The Soviet advance was so quick that the Polish resistance, the AK, the Home Army, did not have time to react. There were no units included in the mobilization plan in Lublin. However, there were volunteers who suddenly came forward, the majority of whom were young boys who had been sworn in but had not been trained. They were given rifles, or found them, or captured them from the Germans, and wanted to shoot, even if they didn't know how to do so. On the 22nd of July 1944, grenades were thrown into the Grand Hotel. At the same time, a platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Mercury dismantled a bridge on the road leading to Warsaw to make it difficult for the Germans to evacuate. When Home Army soldiers met Soviet tankmen, they got on their machines and supported them in the fight. The Poles participated in street fighting in the city centre. On the 23rd of July 1944, the 8th Guards Armoured Corps also attacked Lublin from the vicinity of Krzyczanów. In the area of the Church of St. Michał and the bridge over the Bystryca, 2 battalions of the 58th Armoured Brigade encountered a well-prepared German defence. 2 armoured trains, a Nashorn tank destroyer, a howitzer battery, anti-tank guns, and 2 infantry companies. Due to heavy losses, the Soviets withdrew to the area of Ulica Młynska, where they waited out the night. Also, on the 23rd of July 1944, the city was attacked from the north by the 60th Armoured Brigade and the 301st Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment. In the fighting in the area of the town hall on Ulica Lubotowska, the Soviets lost several Su-76 self-propelled guns and T-34 tanks. The commander of the 301st Regiment, Colonel Mark Yonis, was killed here. In this photograph we can see an artillery piece in the ruins of the former Jewish ghetto. In the background we can see Lublin Castle. The ghetto was based around the castle. It was destroyed after the people had been deported to Bełżec to be murdered there. The heavy tank destroyer, the Nashorn, does not lend itself to street fighting, but in Lublin it took out much Soviet armour. By the 24th of July 1944, the fighting concentrated in the city centre, in the area of Ulica Narutowicza and Plac Wolności, which became the central point of defence. The Germans also successfully defended themselves on Plac Litewski, which was then called Adolf Hitler Platz. The tenement houses in the square were adapted for perimeter defence and turned into mini fortresses. The Germans also had a lot of weapons and ammunition. Soviet tanks lost their tracks on mines and were destroyed by Panzerfausts. The fire of the 88mm cannons which the 7 Nashorns had tore apart the Soviet tanks. In the face of inevitable encirclement, General Moser, commanding the defence, decided to withdraw the remnants of the German group from the city. 6 Kampfgruppe tried to break out at around 0200. Only 1 managed to reach Włocławek, where it encountered part of the German 17th Panzer Division. Hohenfels and Sporleder pushed their forces out of the almost surrounded city in a southeasterly direction during the night of the 23rd to the 24th of July 1944. Of the 500 or so soldiers under their command, only about 250 broke through. The unit lost all its heavy weapons. In the photograph we can see what was probably their last Nashorn, which was lost on Ulica Bernardinska in Lublin. With the failed coup d'etat and almost certain death sentences if they returned, and the prospect of an unpleasant stay with the Red Army if they remained, they chose to commit suicide by shooting themselves in the head somewhere in the region of Tomaszów Lubelski. It's curious that the resistance should have planned for the capture of Lublin given its location so close to the front, although when the plans were laid down it wouldn't have been so near. The fact that the resistance was able to capture stores is also possibly due to the attention of the Gestapo being elsewhere, probably in running away. What is difficult to understand is why bother. I can only assume that Sporleder wanted to be seen doing his bit. But what would this have meant had the coup been successful? Would they then have had to fight the Red Army, which certainly would not have stopped advancing just because Hitler was dead and a new anti-Nazi government was in place? Does this mean that we have to add Lublin to the list of cities where the coup was attempted? Berlin, Paris, Kassel, Vienna and Prague. Sporleder was one of the few members of the Confessing Church who belonged to the Rescuer Resistance and who also had personal contact with members of the military resistance and other resistance groups such as the Kreisau Circle. In his last letter to his mother on the 3rd of July 1944, Sporleder wrote, "It really does look as if God has given up his rule to the dark powers of this earth." But then in the same letter, he reaffirmed his belief that these bad times would end and that good would prevail. There was significant damage inside the city and around 400 residents had been killed in the crossfire. The Red Army took around 2,200 prisoners. After the battle, the Home Army soldiers counted 56 burnt-out Soviet tanks on the streets of the city, but in reality the Soviets may have lost as many as 300, as they were pulled out in order to be repaired as best they could, or cannibalized for parts. As bad as it was, it could have been much worse. Before withdrawing, the Germans planned to blow up 22 of the most important industrial plants in the city, including the city power plant, the gasworks, sugar refineries, and spirits plants. In order to prevent this, both members of the organised Polish resistance and people not involved in resistance activities did what they could to save their places of employment by cutting detonation cords and removing or making safe explosives. Railway workers dismantled tracks to prevent the transport of 11 locomotives to the west. One of the prisoners taken by the Red Army was the man in charge of defending Lublin, SS Gruppenführer Hilmar Moser. He had been in charge since the 10th of May 1944 and was taken prisoner on the 25th of July 1944. On the 29th of August 1944, Moser gave a statement to the High Command of the Red Army about his knowledge of Majdanek concentration camp. Meanwhile, Moser was put on trial in absentia by an SS court and sentenced to be expelled from the SS. Moser was on a list compiled by Lavrenti Beria at the end of August 1945, which contained the names of potential war criminals to be tried before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. In May 1946, he was transferred from Soviet internment to Poland. In Lublin, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison and released to the Federal Republic of Germany in December 1953. Moser took up residence in Deggendorf am Inn in Upper Bavaria, where he died on the 11th of July 1968 at the age of 87. On the 26th of July 1944, the First Polish Army, which had been formed in the Soviet Union earlier that year, entered Lublin. As these troops were fighting for the communists, they were allowed a parade in the city centre. The occupation of Lublin had been horrific. Tens of thousands of people had been killed. The Jewish community had been completely destroyed. Following the breakdown of the rule of law and order in the countryside over the previous 18 months or so, there were many people who had come to Lublin seeking the protection of a big city. So most people were probably genuinely happy to see Soviet troops in Lublin. This was not to last long. Polish Home Army troops could openly walk about the streets until around the 28th of July 1944, but from then on, mass arrests started. Within days, the NKVD had reopened the Majdanek concentration camp and imprisoned members of the Polish resistance organizations. On the night of the 23rd of August 1944, about 250 prisoners were transported to the Dagilev camp near Ryazan, and from there to the gulags in Cherepovets, Gryavovets, Skopin and Suslongia, deep inside the Soviet Union. Thus, Stalin had the capital in which he was able to form his Lublin government, which from Warsaw was to rule Poland for the next 45 years as a puppet of the Kremlin. I would like to thank a number of people who indirectly contributed to this video. First of all is my friend Robert Kowałek, who was an excellent local historian in Lublin. He was director of the museum at Bełżec and worked at the Majdanek Museum. Robert died in Lviv in 2014. The next person is Michael Tregenza, who is another excellent local historian. He's British and he was visiting Lublin since 1965 and living there permanently since the beginning of the 1990s. Krzysztof Tarkowski is the director of the Majdanek Museum and he's written a number of articles and given lectures on the history of the city. The Teatr NN in Lublin has a wonderful archive with a great deal of research, above all in oral history, to recall the city that existed before much of it was destroyed by National Socialism. It's certainly worth a visit, should you be in Lublin. I've done a number of videos relating to Nazi crimes in Poland in the beginning of World War II, and there are some links below. I upload videos every Tuesday and Friday at 2000 hours my time. I'm based in Poland and Germany. I try to be present when videos are premiered, so that is your chance to interact with me and other viewers in real time. In order to know what will be uploaded, then I recommend subscribing. For now, all the best from me in Gdansk, Poland.